Tamu rested his head against Mosey's chest, feeling the rise and fall grow slower with each breath. There was no fight left in the old lion's body, only the weight of years and a silence Tamu had never feared until now. He didn't cry out. He didn't move. He just listened, willing the sound of his mentor's heartbeat to stay a little longer. And then it stopped. No tremble, no last gasp. Just the end of something so ancient, so steady, that the world itself seemed to hesitate. The jungle fell still. Not even the insects dared to hum. Mosey was gone. Tamu didn't move for a long time. His body trembled beneath the stillness. A part of him wanted to roar in pain, to scream the kind of sound that would split the trees and shake the sky. But when he finally opened his mouth, only a low, soft sound came out. It was raw and broken and quiet enough that only those nearby could hear it. A whisper of grief wrapped in reverence. No animal approached. They stood just beyond the clearing's edge, an elephant calf hiding behind its mother, a warthog frozen mid-step, a leopard crouched low. They weren't afraid. They were waiting. They had all felt the shift, the kind that doesn't need to be seen to be understood. Mosey's death was not just the passing of a lion. It was the end of a reign that had never needed blood to rule. Tamu lifted his head. His eyes were dry but hollow, his body heavy with something deeper than exhaustion. He stood on unsteady legs, still pressed close to Mosey's body. He turned slowly, looking at the faces in the trees, behind the brush, among the shadows. No growl, no challenge, just a gaze filled with something no one had seen in a lion before, loss so deep it reshaped everything around it. He took one step forward, then stopped. Behind him lay not just his father figure but the memory of every lesson ever learned, every word, every nudge, every silent look Mosey had given him. All of it led to now. And all of it asked the same question: what comes next? Tamu turned back, toward the body, and sat beside it. He leaned against Mosey once more, this time not as a cub seeking warmth, but as a lion saying goodbye. His tail curled around Mosey's back, a final gesture of closeness, of belonging. He didn't need to speak. He had no words for what had been lost, but somewhere deep in his chest, something new stirred, a feeling he couldn't name yet. It wasn't rage, it wasn't despair, it was purpose. As if Mosey's last breath had entered him, planting a seed that hadn't begun to grow until that moment. A roar would come, but not yet. First, he would sit beside the old lion, honoring not just the death, but the life that had made everything possible. Tamu hadn't always had a name. When Mosey first found him, the cub was no more than skin, bones, and fear. He was curled in, the crook of a gnarled root, his breaths fast and shallow, his eyes wide but fading. He didn't run. He couldn't. There were claw marks on his back and one ear torn. Whatever pride he'd come from had either abandoned him or died trying to protect him. And there he was, small, silent, already expecting the worst. Mosey stood over him for a long time, saying nothing. The older lion could have walked away. Most would have. An orphaned cub that couldn't even stand was not a second chance. He was a burden, a memory waiting to rot. But Mosey didn't walk away. He lay down. At first, the cub didn't react. He simply trembled, his body coiled tight like it had learned that even stillness could be punished. Mosey didn't touch him, didn't nudge or growl, just waited. Minutes passed, maybe longer. And finally, slowly, the cub blinked and took a breath that didn't sound like fear. His paw inched forward, then another. He collapsed halfway across the space between them, and that's where Mosey left him. Close enough to feel his warmth, far enough to let him choose what came next. He brought food the next day. Not much, just a small hair dragged carefully to. The root. The cub sniffed at it, eyes darting between the meat and the lion who had brought it. He didn't eat, not yet, but he didn't turn away. That night, Mosey stayed again. This time, the cub pressed his head just barely against the old lion's shoulder. That was the beginning. Mosey named him Tamu 3 days later. The name meant gentle. No one would have expected a lion to carry such a name, but Mosey saw something in him. Not weakness, not softness, but restraint. A quiet that held weight. A presence not shaped by fear, but by deep awareness. Mosey didn't need a cub that roared early. He needed one that listened first. Tamu followed Mosey everywhere after that. Limping at first, barely keeping up, but never more than a few paces behind. He watched how Mosey never fought unless he had to, how he shared when others hoarded, how he settled conflicts with his eyes before his claws. Tamu soaked in everything, too young to understand it fully, but smart enough to know he was witnessing something different. The jungle had always taught him that kindness was weakness, that silence was submission. But Mosey taught him that stillness could be strength, that kindness could disarm what brute force never could. Each day Mosey offered no lectures, only action. No roars, only presence. And with every step, every quiet gesture, he was teaching Tamu how to lead long before either of them knew a crown would one day fall into his paws. Tamu hadn't just been raised. He had been rebuilt, piece by piece. And all of it began the moment Mosey chose to lie down beside a forgotten cub rather than walk away. Tamu remembered the gazelle. She was young and limping, her back leg twisted from an old injury. She didn't run when Mosey approached. Couldn't. Her sides heaved from exhaustion, her eyes darting in terror but knowing the truth. She was prey. Alone. Cornered. The kind of animal no lion would think twice about ending. Tamu had crouched, ready to pounce, eager to impress Mosey. It would have been his first real kill. He'd practiced the moves. He'd memorized the crouch, the stillness before the sprint. His muscles had tensed, ready to launch, but Mosey didn't give the signal. Instead, he stepped forward. Not as a hunter, but as something Tamu didn't recognize. Yet. He approached the gazelle slowly, head lowered, tail still. She didn't move. She couldn't. Tamu waited, confused, heart racing. Mosey stopped just short of her. His nose touched hers, gently, just once. Then, without a sound, he turned away. Tamu froze, blinking, his breath caught in his throat. Mosey walked past him without speaking, settling on a patch of ground nearby. He didn't look back at the gazelle. He didn't need to. Tamu turned and saw her stagger off, limping, barely alive, but alive all the same. He ran to Mosey, angry, confused. Why? His eyes seemed to ask. He wanted to understand. The hunt was natural. The gazelle was already broken. Mercy made no sense. Mosey didn't answer with words. Instead, he gestured with his paw toward a shaded area near the trees. A pile of meat sat there. Fresh. Caught earlier. Enough for both of them. You already had food? Tamu asked softly, trying to make sense of it. Mosey didn't nod or explain. He simply turned his eyes back to the direction the gazelle had gone. Not in regret. Not in pride. Just peace. That night, Tamu couldn't sleep. He lay beside Mosey but stared into the dark, thinking. He had grown up believing that survival meant taking, that power came from dominance, that mercy was a story told to dying animals to soften the end. But Mosey had taught something else, something that unsettled and comforted him at once. In the morning, Tamu sat beside Mosey and asked the question aloud. Why let her go? Mosey finally looked at him, his voice soft. Because not every fight needs to be won. Tamu didn't speak. He just nodded, his heart swelling with something he didn't have a name for yet. He wasn't sure if it was shame, pride, or just awe. But it stayed with him. It would stay with him for years. That day, he began to understand something Mosey had always known. Real strength doesn't live in your teeth. It lives in your choice not to use them. And as the jungle slept around them, Tamu curled beside the old lion, no longer just a cub learning to hunt, but a lion beginning to learn how to lead. It started with the water. The stream had shrunk to a narrow ribbon of mud, barely enough for the thirsty herds that gathered from all corners of the jungle. Tamu had never seen so many animals in one place. Antelope, buffalo, zebras, even elephants, all clustered near the same trickle, each one tense, impatient, parched. The air felt sharp, not with heat, but with waiting. One wrong move, one step too close, and it would all collapse. Mosi stood at the edge of the bank, watching. He didn't roar. He didn't assert his presence. He just waited. Tamu stood behind him, unsure of what they were doing there. They weren't thirsty. Not yet. And lions had their own ways of getting water. But Mosi had insisted they come. That's when the first argument broke out. A rhino bull shoved his way to the front, snapping branches and tossing his horn. A warthog family squealed, trying to back away, but they were cornered. The other animals bristled. The rhino lowered his head. It was going to spiral into panic. Before anyone moved, Mosi stepped between them. Tamu held his breath. The rhino snorted, puffing clouds of tension, eyeing the lion that dared interrupt. Mosi didn't flinch. He didn't posture. He just looked. His gaze wasn't threatening. It was calm, steady. The rhino stopped once, then twice. But Mosi didn't move. He didn't fight. He didn't growl. He just waited. And slowly the rhino stopped. The warthog shuffled back. Safe. The tension rippled, but didn't snap. Mosi turned to the crowd, walked to the edge of the water, and sat. Just sat. He dipped his paw in the stream once and pulled it back. Then he looked around, at the impala, at the hyenas lurking, even at the vultures overhead. Then he laid down and closed his eyes. Tamu didn't understand at first, but the others did. One by one, the animals began forming a line. Loose, hesitant, but a line nonetheless. They drank in turns. A few squabbled, but no one pushed. No one ran. And not once did Mosi get up. He didn't need to. His quiet presence held more influence than a dozen teeth could ever threaten. Tamu watched it all unfold like a lesson without words. Mosi had claimed nothing, but everyone had given him respect. Not out of fear, but out of understanding. Because the lion who could have taken the water for himself had chosen not to. Later that night, Tamu asked him, "Why didn't you stop the rhino sooner?" Mosi looked at him and replied, "Because if I roar first, no one listens. If I wait, they choose to." Tamu felt something settle in his chest, a realization so gentle it almost hurt. Leadership wasn't about being followed. It was about giving others the space to choose peace. And on that quiet night, watching Mosi rest beside him, Tamu understood that kindness wasn't the absence of power. It was the decision to use it sparingly. Tamu had never asked about the scars. They stretched across Mosi's back like rivers dried up in the sun, raised, jagged, impossible to ignore. One ran along his hind leg, another crossed over his left shoulder. No other lion bore marks like those. And yet Mosi never winced when he walked. He never hid them. He simply lived with them, quietly, as if they had always belonged. But one evening, after a long walk through the eastern trail, Mosi stopped. He stood staring at a cluster of trees Tamu didn't recognize. Not at first, but Mosi did. His body went still. Not tense, just still. And then, without turning his head, he spoke. "This is where I learned what kindness feels like." Tamu blinked. The words didn't make sense. He stepped closer, watching Mosi's eyes soften, like he was seeing something that wasn't there anymore. "I was caught," Mosi said, "long before you, before I found peace, before I knew what I was meant for. I stepped into a wire trap, the kind humans set." Tamu's breath caught. "I pulled," Mosi continued. "I fought, I bled. For 3 days. No one came. The silence between them thickened. Tamu had never imagined Mosi as helpless. The thought of the great lion struggling, afraid, hurt, shattered something in him. Then a child came, Mosi whispered, barely taller than the grass. A human, alone. She shouldn't have been there. But she was. She saw me. I thought she'd scream, run, or worse. What did she do? Tamu asked. She cried, Mosi said. Tamu froze. She knelt, Mosi said, voice thinning. She took out a small blade. Her hands shook. But she cut the wire. She cried the whole time. But she didn't stop. She freed me. Tamu's heart twisted. He couldn't picture it. A child, a human. A lion bleeding and broken. And still, that child had stayed. I could have killed her, Mosi said. I could have run. But I didn't. I stayed. I laid my head on the ground. She sat beside me for hours. I don't remember how I got back, but I never forgot her face, her kindness. It changed me. Tamu looked at the scars again. They weren't signs of weakness. They were reminders of grace. You've never told anyone? He asked. No one ever asked, Mosi replied. Then he looked at Tamu. But I needed you to know, before I go. Tamu felt his throat tighten. Why tell me now? Mosi smiled faintly. Because someday you'll find someone who needs saving, and you'll hesitate. And I want you to remember, one act of kindness, even from someone small, can shape everything that comes after. Tamu didn't speak. He just stepped closer and lay beside the old lion, his head resting against the place where the deepest scar ran. And in that silence, he began to understand that even the strongest need saving. And the ones who save us, sometimes they're not lions at all. Mosi woke him early that morning with a single glance. Tamu stretched, expecting another long walk or perhaps a shared hunt. But Mosi said only one thing. There's a quarrel between two young males by the southern ridge. I want you to handle it. Tamu blinked. Alone? Mosi didn't nod. He didn't smile. He just looked at him with the calm certainty that had always made everything feel safe. It's time. Tamu didn't question it aloud, but doubt stirred in his chest. He wasn't Mosi. He didn't have that commanding stillness or the weight of experience behind his eyes. But Mosi didn't offer a speech. He turned and walked away, as if the matter was already settled. Tamu stood there for a long moment before finally moving. His paws felt heavier than usual, and every step toward the southern ridge felt like walking into something he wasn't ready for. He'd never had to lead without Mosi near. Not really. And now, the silence at his side echoed louder than any roar. When he reached the ridge, the tension was thick in the air. Two young lions, barely older than he had been when Mosi found him, were pacing, circling each other. The ground bore the marks of aggression. One had a bleeding scratch above his eye. The other's tail swayed low, defensive. A group of animals stood at a distance, watching, waiting to see how this would play out. If it became a fight, others would be dragged in. Chaos would follow. The balance Mosi had spent years shaping could be undone in minutes. Tamu stepped between them. Both lions stopped. They hadn't expected him. They didn't move, but their eyes narrowed. He didn't bare his teeth. He didn't raise his voice. He just looked at them, each of them, and said, "Why?" At first there was only silence. Then one of them spoke, voice low and bitter. "He took food from my cache," the other snapped back. "It was rotting. You weren't coming back." Tamu let them speak. He didn't interrupt. He didn't correct. He let the words pour out, anger, blame, fear. When they were finished, he looked at both of them again and said nothing. Just breathed, waited. Finally, he walked to the half-empty water hole nearby and dragged a dead branch into the middle of it. Then he stepped back. "If either of you wants to fight," he said, "do it here. But when you finish, no one will want to drink here. No one wins." They looked at him. then at each other. The message was clear. This wasn't dominance. This was consequence. The two lions stood still. Then, slowly, one backed away. The other followed. No more words were exchanged. No blood spilled. Tamu turned and walked away, not needing to watch. That night he returned to Mosi and found him resting, in the grass. Tamu didn't speak. He just sat beside him. Mosi looked at him once and bowed his head, only slightly. A gesture Tamu had never seen before. It was the first time the old lion had looked at him not as a student, but as an equal. Mosi no longer rose with the sun. At first, Tamu pretended not to notice. He lingered nearby longer in the mornings, waiting for that familiar grunt, that subtle head tilt that signaled it was time to move. But Mosi didn't stir. He slept more, ate less. The days grew quieter not because the jungle changed, but because Mosi was retreating from it. Tamu stayed close. He hunted for both of them now, bringing food to Mosi's usual resting place and nudging it gently near. Mosi ate only when he had to. He never complained, never showed pain. But his breaths were slower, his steps shorter. His eyes still held light, but it was softer now, distant, like they were already looking at something beyond what Tamu could see. One evening, after the jungle had stilled, Mosi called him closer. Tamu laid beside him, their shoulders touching. Mosi didn't speak right away. Instead, he simply stared upward for a long time, as if listening to something only he could hear. "I used to fear this part," Mosi said at last, voice low and rough. "The slowing down, the being left behind. But it doesn't feel like loss now. It feels like returning." Tamu didn't answer. He couldn't. His throat was tight. His jaw clenched. Mosi turned his head, looking at him with a gaze that still commanded silence. "You were never just a cub to me. You were the part of me that could begin again." Tamu blinked, but the tears came anyway. He didn't bother to hide them. Mosi continued, each word slower than the last. "You know the rules now. But more than that, you know when to break them. You've chosen peace without being asked. That matters more than strength." Tamu whispered, "I don't want you to go." Mosi smiled faintly. "You don't have to want it. You just have to live through it." They laid there side by side until the sky shifted and the stars began to show. Mosi's breathing slowed, like the jungle was rocking him gently toward the end. Tamu watched each breath like it was a thread holding the world together. "Don't roar in anger when I'm gone," Mosi said, so softly it nearly vanished into the air. "Roar for those who never had a voice. Roar for those still afraid." Tamu lowered his head beside the old lions and closed his eyes. Neither of them moved again that night, and somewhere in the darkness, without words or warning, the torch passed, not in fire, but in silence, not in fury, but in love. Tamu didn't leave his side for hours. Mosi's body had gone still long ago, but Tamu couldn't move. His head rested beside the lion who had raised him, shaped him, softened the wildness in him. The body was heavy and lifeless now, but the bond between them hadn't loosened. It pulsed quietly, like a heartbeat that refused to fade. The jungle watched. Word had spread. No roar had been sounded. No alarm cried. But they knew. From the smallest bird to the oldest elephant, something had changed. And they came. Not in fear, not in hunger, but in silence. A circle formed around the clearing. Hyenas sat, not laughing but low to the ground, heads bowed. Antelope moved. In from the tall brush, not to run, but to stand still. Even a jaguar, foreign and solitary, lingered at the edge, watching with eyes not meant for grief, yet softened by it. No one approached the body. Tamu rose slowly, his legs stiff. He turned in a full circle, looking at every creature that had come. They said nothing. They waited. Not for a leader, not for dominance, but for something they didn't know how to name. He looked down at Mosey one last time and whispered, "You were more than king." Then, without fanfare or force, he stepped away from the body. It felt wrong to leave him, but even in death, Mosey was teaching him something. Let go. Walk forward. He moved to the center of the circle. Every animal's eyes followed. He didn't speak. He didn't roar. He didn't claim anything. He just sat, strong, calm, alone, and still no one moved. Minutes passed like hours. Then a small fawn stepped forward, no taller than Tamu's shoulder when seated. It crept past larger animals, past predators that should have made it freeze. But it didn't stop until it stood in front of Tamu. Then, in the simplest gesture of trust, it lowered its head. The jungle breathed again. A wild dog padded forward next. Then a baboon. Then 2 jackals. One by one, they approached. Not in submission, but in recognition. They weren't pledging loyalty. They were answering a call they hadn't heard aloud. Tamu didn't smile. He didn't need to. His silence said more than any roar could have. Later that night, as the moon bathed, the clearing, no one had touched Mosey's body. Not out of fear, but out of respect. And Tamu lay nearby, not as a ruler among subjects, but as a thread connecting every soul around him. The jungle didn't need a new king. It needed a keeper. And somehow, without trying, Tamu had become exactly that. The lioness came 3 days later. Tamu was lying in the shade when he heard soft footsteps behind him. He didn't lift his head. Not right away. He'd learned that quiet was often stronger than presence. When the steps stopped, he turned. She stood there, lean and watchful, 3 cubs tucked nervously behind her legs. Her fur was scarred at the shoulder, her ribs visible, her eyes sharp but tired. She didn't flinch when he met her gaze. "I don't come for protection," she said. Tamu didn't answer. "I come because they need a future," she added, her voice steadier now. "And I heard you offer one." Tamu finally stood. He didn't ask where she came from. He didn't question why she'd waited. He simply stepped aside. The cubs hesitated. Then the smallest took a step forward, staring at him, unafraid. Tamu lowered his head until their eyes met. The cub didn't blink. Then, like it had been decided before they ever arrived, the others followed. That night, the lioness curled near, the water's edge with her cubs, eyes half closed but alert. Tamu sat in the distance, not guarding her, but watching, acknowledging her presence, her strength. She had not come broken. She had come brave. More came after her. An old wildebeest, blind in one eye whose herd had long since scattered. 2 cheetah siblings who hadn't spoken since their mother disappeared. A one-winged eagle who refused to leave the branch above Tamu's perch. None of them asked for anything. They just stayed. Tamu never told them what to do. He didn't form a council. He didn't mark boundaries. He didn't declare anything. Still, harmony emerged. Not perfect, but real. The jackals stopped stealing. The hyenas laughed more softly, less viciously. The predators hunted only when they had to, and not near the watering hole. The prey no longer bolted when they heard paws behind them. Trust had not replaced fear entirely, but it was beginning to challenge it. One morning, Tamu caught sight of the smallest cub climbing atop the very rock where Mosey once lay. The cub raised its head and let out a high, awkward sound, half growl, half yawn. The jungle didn't laugh. It listened, because even a small roar in the right place mattered. Tamu closed his eyes, letting the sound wash over him. He felt Mosey everywhere. Now, not as a ghost, but as a foundation. This wasn't about succession. This was about continuation. Kindness hadn't made him weak. It had made the jungle stronger. And as the breeze stirred the grass and the cub's roar faded, Tamu realized something simple, something sacred. He didn't have to be the loudest voice, he just had to make sure every voice had a place to be heard. The hyena limped into the clearing with no warning. His left side was bloodied, his steps uneven. Tamu recognized him instantly. Scarface, one of the old scavengers who had once tormented the fringes of Mosi's territory. A hyena who'd mocked, provoked, stolen. Tamu remembered him clearly. Those sneers, those snarls, the way he'd circled prey long after the kill was over. Now, he stood on shaking legs, alone, too proud to beg, but too broken to run. The animals, near the watering hole, scattered back. Even the lioness with her cubs tensed, her eyes narrowing. No one needed to speak to know what they were thinking. He doesn't belong here. Tamu stood. The silence grew thick again. Scarface met his eyes. He didn't flinch, but there was no challenge in his stance, only need. Tamu walked forward. Each step drew the eyes of the entire jungle. Would he drive him out? Would he roar? Would he avenge Mosi's history with punishment? He stopped just inches from the wounded hyena. For a moment they stood that way. Old. Scars facing new wounds. Leader facing rival. Mercy staring down memory. Then Tamu lowered his head. He didn't speak. He didn't growl. He simply turned toward the watering hole and took a slow step back, leaving a clear path. The hyena stared. Tamu looked over his shoulder, not with threat, but with invitation. Scarface took one step, then another, and finally he drank. No one moved. The world felt still again, not because of death, but because of a choice that went against every instinct carved by fear. After a long moment, a young monkey crept forward and tossed a piece of fruit near the hyena's paws. A moment later, a wild dog approached and dropped a strip of bark. Not food, but cover, offered like a blanket. Scarface didn't speak. He just sank to the ground, exhausted, resting beside the very ones who once would have chased him off. That night, Tamu lay beneath the old tree, watching the stars alone. The lioness approached quietly. "You let him stay," she said. "He didn't ask," Tamu replied, "but he came." She didn't question further. She didn't need to. In her silence, he heard respect. What Tamu had done wasn't forgiveness. It was choice, a choice to disrupt the old cycle. A choice to give even the undeserving a space to begin again. And somewhere deep in the jungle, an old lesson echoed, not in Mosi's voice, but in Tamu's own thoughts. Kindness isn't something you extend only to the worthy. It's what you offer when it's hardest to give, and with that, the jungle softened again. Not in weakness, but in healing. The change didn't come in a single moment. It crept in quietly, like water shaping stone. It began with how the young behaved. The smallest jackal pups no longer snapped at one another over scraps. They waited their turn. The cubs, even the boldest ones, learned to share kills with scavengers. And one morning, Tamu watched in awe as a crocodile allowed a stork to clean its teeth, gently, respectfully, with no threat exchanged. These were not instincts. These were choices. And those choices had a root. Tamu walked among them, not as a figure of fear, but as a presence that reminded others what was possible. The predators still hunted. The rules of the wild had not vanished. But now there were lines few dared to cross. It wasn't about dominance. It was about balance. The jungle had become something Mosi only dreamed of, a place not ruled by teeth, but by trust. One evening, a young lion from the northern range arrived, his chest puffed with pride, his roar loud and careless. He charged into the water hole, scattering the smaller animals, flashing his claws. He demanded recognition. No one moved. Tamu rose slowly from the far side. He didn't snarl. He didn't rush. He simply walked forward until they stood face to face. "I heard you rule through silence," the young lion said, circling. "I thought that meant you had nothing to say." Tamu didn't answer. The lion pushed again. "If you're so strong, prove it." Tamu's gaze stayed steady. "You're afraid of fighting," the younger growled. Tamu stepped aside. "Go ahead," he said softly. "Take the water." The young lion blinked. "Take it," Tamu said again. "And make sure no one else drinks." The weight of those words landed. The lion looked around, at the zebras, the antelope, the cubs, the birds, at the sheer calm of the place, something he had never seen in his range, where everything was taken and nothing shared. He looked at Tamu again, who hadn't moved, hadn't flexed a muscle. The challenger turned, walked to the water, and drank, alone. Then, quietly, he walked back and lay near the edge of the trees, watching. He didn't leave. Tamu said nothing, but he saw it in the lion's posture. Something had shifted. That night, as fireflies danced and the leaves whispered high above, the lioness came to Tamu's side. "He could have fought," she said. "He could have," Tamu agreed, "but he didn't. No. Why? Because he saw that silence holds more than power. It holds peace." She nodded once. No more needed to be said, and high above them, a shooting star crossed the sky. Maybe it was just coincidence, or maybe the jungle was finally learning that not every roar needs to be heard to change everything. Tamu woke before the sun. The jungle was quiet, but not with grief, with peace. He rose slowly, not from stiffness, but from reflection. Around him, the clearing pulsed with gentle life. The lioness and her cubs still slept near the trees. The blind wildebeest rested in the grass beside two jackals. Scarface, thinner now but healing, dozed near the water's edge. This was no kingdom. It was something softer, something stronger. Tamu walked to the center of the old clearing, the same place where Mosi had laid for the last time. The grass had grown back, but the earth still held the memory of his shape. Tamu stood there for a long time, eyes closed, remembering everything. Not just Mosi's lessons, but his presence. He remembered the warmth of his silence, the strength in his restraint, the way he listened before acting and waited before deciding, and how, through all of it, he never asked Tamu to become him. He simply showed him how to become someone better. Tamu looked up at the sky and whispered, "It's still yours, but I'll carry it now." Behind him, soft steps approached. It was the smallest cub, the one who had once roared clumsily from atop Mosi's rock. He stood beside Tamu, mimicking his posture. Tamu didn't look down, but he felt the weight of that presence. "You don't have to be me," Tamu said gently. "I don't want to be," the cub replied. "I want to be like you." Tamu smiled, a small, quiet expression that held more emotion than sound ever could. Then, slowly, he raised his head and let out a roar. Not of warning, not of dominance, but of memory, of gratitude, of love. The jungle echoed. From the birds in the canopy to the foxes in the hollows, every creature paused. Every heart lifted, because they understood that this roar wasn't to claim anything. It was to honor what had made all this possible. Far away, where the jungle met the mountains, a rumble rolled through the trees. Some said it was the wind. Others said it was the ground shifting, but those who stood in the clearing knew. It was Mosi, answering one last time. Tamu lowered his head, heart full, eyes calm. He had no crown, no throne, only a place in the wild where kindness had bloomed in silence and somehow, against all odds, taken root. And in that moment, with the sun finally rising, the jungle did not need a king. It had something far more powerful. A legacy that roared through quiet strength, and one lion willing to carry it forward.